Hello, everyone. Dr. Mad here. Let's get mad about an inspector calls. So we are about halfway through Act 1. So we've got to this point here, and the inspector has arrived. He's interviewing the family, starting mainly with Mr. Burling. And initially, Mr. Burling didn't know what he was talking about, but now he's seen the photo of Eva Smith, and he's starting to remember her. So let's listen to a bit more.
And I'm sure you've no objection, have you, Inspector? Oh, perhaps I ought to explain first that this is Mr. Gerald Croft, son of Sir George Croft, Crofts Limited.
Mr. Gerald Croft, eh?
We've been celebrating his engagement to my daughter Sheila.
Mr. Croft is going to marry Miss Sheila Burling?
That's right.
Then I prefer you to stay.
Oh, very well.
Look, there's nothing mysterious about this business. And as it happened nearly 2 years ago, obviously it has nothing whatever to do with the wretched girl's suicide. Eh, Inspector?
I can't agree with you there, sir.
Why not?
Because what happened to her then may have determined what happened to her afterwards. And what happened to her afterwards may have driven her to suicide. A chain of events.
Oh, well, put like that, there's something in what you say. Still, I can't accept any responsibility. If we were all responsible for everything that happened to everybody we'd had anything to do with, it would be very awkward, wouldn't it?
Very awkward.
By Jove, yes. And as you were saying, Dad, a man has to look after himself.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Now, Inspector, about this Eva Smith. I remember her quite well now. She was a lively girl, a good worker too. In fact, the foreman in the machine shop where she worked told me he was ready to promote her into what we call a leading operator, head of a small group of girls. But after they came back from their holidays that August, they suddenly decided to ask for more money. They were averaging about 22 and 6, neither more nor less than is paid generally in our industry. But they wanted the rate raised to about 25 shillings a week. Well, I refused, of course.
Why?
Why?
Yes. Why did you refuse?
Inspector, I don't see that it's any concern of yours how I choose to run my business.
It might be.
I don't like your tone. Or all these questions.
It's my duty to ask questions.
Okay, so let's stop there and let's go back to where we were. So remember, the audio version and the written version is a bit different, but we are challenging ourselves to try and match up the words. So it will force you to make sure that you are listening. So this page is, we can kind of skip through this, okay? Although again here, notice he's always name dropping, always hinting at how important he is and the important people that he's connected to. So let's skip to the next page. So this page is really important. Well, let's start with this bit here. So initially, Burling is like, okay, fine. This poor girl committed suicide, but what's it got to do with us? And the inspector says, it does. And this quote here is extremely important. So I mentioned it in the context video as well, the overview video, a chain of events. So Priestley was very much interested in the effects of actions over time, of people's actions over time. Okay. And then this also is important, again, that Burling, he doesn't believe in communal responsibility. He doesn't believe in being responsible for other people, for each other. Okay, so this is really important here. So two quotes here. So this quote here and this line here. Okay. Okay, so let's move to the next line. So this page is really important. So initially notice that Eric kind of sides with his father, but as the play goes on, he's going to change. He's going to turn against or disagree with his father, okay? And this whole speech here is really important. So now he remembers her quite well, and lively girl. The words in the audio are quite different here, but the essentials are the same. And so notice she's a good worker. So there was no reason to sack her for not being good. I think we can all agree, no matter whether we're socialists or capitalists, if somebody doesn't do a good job, then you are kind of entitled to ask them to find another job, especially if you've given them lots of chances. But in this case, that is not an issue. She's a good worker and she's going to be promoted, okay, leading operator, so like a team leader. But then when they came back from their holidays, all the workers, not just her, wanted more money. So 22 and 6 means 22 shillings, which is a shilling was about 12 pence in those days. You can work out how much it is. I mean, don't need to really worry about that. Obviously, it would have been worth more in those days than now, but still, it would have been the absolute bare minimum that the employers could get away with. Okay, and then she wants a pay rise, or they all want a pay rise, and it works out to about an 11% pay rise. And he says, I refused, of course. And the inspector says, why? And notice in the audio and here, he's really surprised. He doesn't understand why why the inspector doesn't understand. From his point of view, it makes complete sense. He's a capitalist, he's running a business, and it's his job to maximize his profits, which basically means keeping his labor costs down as much as possible. Because if you remember, your labor costs are the biggest cost of a business, generally speaking. Okay, so let's move on to the next page. Okay, so this bit is fairly straightforward, and then we stopped here. So notice I was talking about labor costs. So actually, he's going to talk about that, but let's listen to the audio and then we'll go through it.
So, why did you refuse?
If I'd agreed to this demand for a new rate, we'd have added about 12% to our labour costs. Does that satisfy you? We were paying the usual rates, and if they didn't like those rates, they could go and work somewhere else. It's a free country, I told them.
It isn't if you can't go and work somewhere else.
Keep out of this, Eric. You hadn't even started in the works when this happened. So they went on strike. That didn't last long, of course.
Oh, not if it was just after the holidays. They'd all be broke if I know them.
They mostly were. And so was the strike after a week or two. A pitiful affair. Well, we let them all come back at the old rates, except the 4 or 5 ringleaders who'd started the trouble. I went down myself and told them to clear out. This girl, Eva Smith, was one of them. So she had to go.
You couldn't have done anything else.
He could. He could have kept her on instead of throwing her out. I call it tough luck.
Rubbish. If you don't come down sharply on some of these people, they'd soon be asking for the earth.
They might. But after all, it's better to ask for the earth than to take it.
What did you say your name was, Inspector?
Goole. Goole.
How'd you get on with our Chief Constable, Colonel Roberts?
I don't see much of him.
Perhaps I ought to warn you that he's an old friend, and I see him fairly frequently. We play golf together sometimes.
I don't play golf.
I didn't suppose you did.
Well, I think it's a damn shame.
I never wanted to play.
I mean about this girl. I don't see why she should have been sacked just because she'd a bit more spirit than the others. I'd have let her stay.
Unless you brighten your ideas, you'll never be in a position to let anybody stay or tell them to go. It's about time you learned to face responsibilities. That's something this public school and varsity life you've had doesn't seem to teach you.
Well, we don't need to tell the inspector all about that, do we?
I don't.
Okay, so let's stop there and let's just go back to where we were. So we stopped here where Burling is really surprised as to why the inspector doesn't understand why he refused to raise their wages. And so we stopped at this point. So as I was saying, he emphasized this point here, that it's his duty to keep labor costs down because those are basically the main costs of a business. And I said about 11%, but so 11, 12%. And then he says this thing about, oh, it's a free country, they can go and work somewhere else. And then this argument about it's a free country, you can go and work somewhere else. So this is the standard argument that capitalists use. Obviously, the other side of it, and in fact, Eric makes that argument that if there are no other options, then are you really free? Now, that's a very difficult question. At GCSE level, you don't really need to worry about it. But if you are aiming for the very high grades, it's something you might want to think about and maybe do your own research and come up with some view. There's no right or wrong. If you were to write something about that in your essay, that would definitely get high marks, no matter what you actually wrote, as long as it was well reasoned. And then if we just carry on here, notice how Gerald talks about these working people. He looks down on them just like Burling does. They'll be broke. So broke means when you haven't got any money. So he's saying that they're not careful. They'll go out and spend all their money and then have nothing left. Of course, the other side of it would be that's not really true. I mean, he's kind of implying that they'll waste it on drink and smoking and whatever. But the truth is that the money they're earning is probably just enough to pay for their basic expenses. So if they haven't got any money by the end of the week or whatever, it's probably because they're not being actually paid enough. And Burling agrees with him. So notice Burling and Gerald are always on the same side. Only Eric and later on Sheila, they are going to more increasingly go on to the other side. And then he says, oh, it's a pitiful affair. And he went down and sacked them himself. And notice again how he talks about her. She had a lot to say for herself. And Gerald totally agrees. So notice no sympathy for Eva Smith or any of the girls. But Eric, so Priestley is using these characters to present both sides of the argument. Burling and Gerald on one side, Eric on the other. So let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so here, these phrases might be a bit tricky to understand. You don't need to worry too much about it, but just in case you're wondering. So he's saying, oh, if you're not strong on these people, they'll be asking for the earth. And Gerald agrees with him. And inspector says, oh, it's better to ask than take it. So in other words, what the inspector is saying, that people like Mr. Burling and Gerald, the rich and powerful, they just take everything. They don't ask for it. They take it. Whereas poor Eva Smith has to ask for it. And even when she does ask for it, she gets sacked. That's her reward for asking. And now Burling asks for his name again, and we've got the spelling. So remember, Ghoul, Ghoul, is also a ghost. And what's he doing here, Burling? Name dropping again. By the way, this had a small c earlier, should have been a capital C, so I've corrected that. So yeah, Mr. Burling just name dropping, trying to impress and kind of intimidate Inspector Ghoul. But the inspector is not intimidated. He says, oh, I don't play golf. And then on the next slide, little bit of humor here from Priestley, but this is not a funny play at all, and humor is not a big part of Priestley's style, unlike who's the other author that you may have studied that uses a lot of humor? So Charles Dickens, if you're studying A Christmas Carol. Okay, so this is where we left off. So now let's go and listen to a bit more audio.
Don't see that we need to tell the inspector anything more. In fact, there's nothing I can't tell him. I told the girl to clear out. She went. That's the last I heard of her. What happened to her after that? Go on the streets, did she?
Not exactly.
What's this about streets? Oh, sorry, I didn't know we had a visitor. Mummy sent me to ask why you didn't come along to the drawing room.
We shall be along in a minute now. Just finishing.
I'm afraid not.
There's nothing else, you know.
What's this about?
Nothing to do with you, Sheila. Run along.
Just a minute, Miss Burling.
Look here, Inspector. I consider this uncalled for and officious. I've half a mind to report you. I've told you all I know. And now there isn't the slightest reason why my daughter should be dragged into this business.
What business? What's happening?
I'm a police inspector, Miss Burling. This afternoon, a young woman drank some disinfectant and died in the infirmary after several hours of agony.
Oh, how horrible. Was it an accident?
No. She wanted to end her life. She felt she couldn't go on any longer.
Well, don't tell me that's because I discharged her from my employment nearly 2 years ago.
That might have started it.
Did you, Dad?
The girl had been causing trouble in the works. I was quite justified.
Yes, I think you were. I know we'd have done the same thing. Don't look like that, Sheila.
Sorry, it's just I can't help thinking about this girl destroying herself so horribly. And I've been so happy tonight. I wish you hadn't told me. What was she like? Quite young?
24.
Pretty?
She wasn't pretty when I saw her today.
Oh.
That's enough of that.
I don't really see that this inquiry gets you anywhere, Inspector. It's what happened to her since she left Mr. Burling's works that is important. And we can't help you there because we don't know.
Are you all sure you don't know?
Are you suggesting now that one of them knows something about this girl?
Yes.
You didn't come here just to see me, then?
No.
Well, of course, if I'd known that earlier, I wouldn't have called you officious and talked about reporting you. You understand that, don't you, Inspector? I thought that you were making the most of this tiny bit of information I could give you. You sure of your facts?
Some of them? Yes.
I can't think they could be of any great consequence.
The girl's dead, though.
You talk as if we were responsible.
Just a minute, Sheila. Inspector, you and I had better go and talk this over quietly in a corner.
Why should you? He's finished with you. He says it's one of us now.
Well, I've never known an Eva Smith.
Neither have I.
Was that her name? Eva Smith?
Yes.
Never heard it before.
So, where are you now, Inspector?
Where I was before.
Okay, so let's just pause there and let's go back to where we were. So, as I was saying, a little bit of unintentional humor here. But now Eric is presenting Priestley's side of the argument that why shouldn't she try for higher wages and we try for the highest possible prices. So the basic argument between socialism and capitalism being presented here in very simple terms. And just because she'd asked for higher wages doesn't mean that she needed to be sacked. So he's saying he would have let us stay. And Burling says, well, if you behave like that, if you run a business like that, you're not going to get anywhere. And here basically suggesting that Eric is spoiled. And Eric sulkily, so again, on the one hand, still this idea of this young, immature person, but we can see in front of our eyes Eric starting to mature, starting to argue against his father, starting to think for himself, come up with his own arguments. And Burling then just repeating the points he said earlier, but then notice again his attitude towards Eva Smith and girls like that is automatic assumption that, so instead of feeling sorry for her, he's saying, oh, go on the streets. And the thing is that the way he says it hides what a terrible thing it is to go on the streets. Okay. I mean, what this means exactly, we're not sure, but the connotations are, well, firstly, the connotations of being homeless for a start, but he has other connotations. He's suggesting that she has become a prostitute. She's gone and sold herself on the streets. And he shows no sympathy for that. I mean, even if that's what Eva Smith has done, that's a horrible thing to think that somebody you sacked has had to go on the streets, either as a homeless person or to sell their body to pay for the basics, or that she's got herself into trouble with the law or something like that. Okay, so the inspector says not exactly. Okay, so most of this page we can sort of skip. So Sheila enters and notice she's all happy and everything, and they just kind of talk. But notice here how Burling talks to his daughter, run along, treating her like a child, really. But the inspector says, no, wait. And then Burling is getting angry, and the way he's talking to the inspector, normally you'd be a bit kind of careful and a bit scared of how you talk to a police officer. But notice he looks down on the inspector. The inspector is a working class person. Burling is middle class. And officious means being like over keen in how you do your job, being a bit too formal and petty. And so notice how he threatens him, that he's going to report him and saying, oh, you don't need to drag my daughter into this unpleasant business. Okay, so Sheila comes in further. She doesn't just go away like her father's told her to. And the inspector obviously repeats the information. But now notice that Sheila's reaction is totally different to Mr. Burling. She's understands how horrible it is, and Priestley uses these techniques here. So O is an exclamation of feeling, the dash, the pause, and the exclamation mark, the emotive language, how horrible, yeah? So totally different reaction to Mr. Burling. And then that you can read for yourselves. And Burling justifies it, saying, oh, she had been causing trouble. Actually, I think I'm getting a bit ahead of the audio version there. So let's listen to a bit more audio.
Oh, Mr. Croft, I told you she'd used more than one name. She was still Eva Smith when Mr. Burling sacked her for wanting 25 shillings a week instead of 22 and 6. But after that, she stopped being Eva Smith. Perhaps she'd had enough of it.
Can't blame her.
Do you know what happened to this girl after she left my works?
Yes. She was out of work.
Actually, sorry. So we've got up to this point in the audio. So let's just go back to where we were. So this is where we'd left off. So this page is just showing Sheila's reaction again. So very distressed, unlike Gerald, unlike Mr. Burling, and lots more emotive language here. And contrasting with her own life. Yeah. So Sheila's life, privileged, rich, having this nice dinner, and this poor girl at the same time killing herself. And then here, so again, the talking and the emotive language. Okay, so we can skip to the next slide. And then here there are hints that there's more to all this than meets the eye. And for that reason, and maybe Burling is now starting to sense there's something not quite right, so he changes his tone and he apologizes for threatening to report him. Okay, so we can move on to the next slide. And then, yeah, so this you can just read through. This is just the story continuing and the interaction between the characters. And they say, oh, we don't know any Eva Smith. So we know that Eva Smith did use different names. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. And then here we can kind of mostly skip through this, but except for, so just notice these lines here, the inspector informing them that she did use different names. So this is all obviously setting the scene up for the later part of the story, foreshadowing what's going to happen later on. Okay, so this is where we got to. And actually, that's probably a good point to stop this video. So I'll just skip to the last slide as usual. If you found this video useful, please do subscribe and tell all your friends about it. And then in the next video, we'll carry on almost at the end now. Probably one more video to kind of finish off, and then another one to summarize Act 1 and pick out some key quotes and do some questions and answers to make sure that you are understanding what's happening in Act 1. So see you in the next video.